My paper is Unbecoming Human, Plant Horror and Masochistic Desire in Kang's The Vegetarian. The Vegetarian is a novel of refusal. Kang defines vegetarian as another word for rejecter. When she was writing the novel, she says she was driven by its final image. In the last part, I didn't want to describe the death of Yonghai. I wanted to end this book with a final scene where In-hai looks out of the ambulance window with a protesting gaze. I felt that this was a scene of gazing with all one's energy at this world of mingling violence and beauty, without start or finish, only struggling tenaciously with her open eyes. The central themes of the novel, as identified through its final image, and the image which precipitated the novel itself, are those of protest, rejection, pain, violence, beauty, and pleasure. My own engagement with the novel begins with a similar moment. This image occurs at the end of the novel and is characterized by a similarly defiant gaze. Yonghai says, "No one can understand me. The doctors, the nurses, they're all the same. They don't even try to understand. They just force me to take medication and stab me with needles." Yonghai's voice was slow and quiet, but firm. In-hai couldn't hold herself back any longer. "You," she yelled. "I'm acting like this because I'm afraid you're going to die." Yonghai turned her head and stared blankly at In-hai, as though the latter were not her sister, but a complete stranger. After a while, the question came. Why? Is it such a bad thing to die? This final, yet I would argue central image exemplifies the masochistic entanglements of Yonghai's desire to become a plant. The simple yet confounding question, "Is it such a bad thing to die?" articulates a mindscape whose inscrutable dreams, desires, and visions are the site of the novel's politics. But what constitutes a masochistic politics? For Jack Halberstam, a masochistic politics is unbecoming. Unbecoming is a political project articulated in the form of refusal. Halberstam situates this unbecoming within a broader critique which is traceable to post-colonial and black feminism, which argues that as long as agency, subjectivity, and politics are structured around calls to action which reify the colonial, masculinist, and heteronormative values ascribed to the fantasy of an active, autonomous, and self-activating individualism, then the complete refusal of the subject offers a radical alternative. In particular, then, unbecoming means to think in terms of the negation of the subject rather than her formation, the undoing of the self rather than its activation. Halberstam appeals to a shadow archive of resistance, one that does not speak in the language of action and momentum, but instead articulates itself in terms of evacuation, refusal, passivity, unbecoming, and unbeing. The key figure in this archive is the masochist, whose masochism reconciles the supposedly irreconcilable tension between pleasure and death. The masochist tethers her notion of self to a spiral of pain and hurt. She refuses to cohere. She refuses to fortify herself against the knowledge of death and dying. The masochist therefore exemplifies the pleasure of unbecoming, unbeing, and unravelling. Halberstam also sees a refusal to speak as an important feature of unbecoming. He claims that in unbecoming we find no feminist subject, but only subjects who cannot speak, who refuse to speak, subjects who unravel, who refuse to cohere, subjects who refuse being. Yonghai is one such subject. Her lack of speech is a formal feature of the novel's structure, which is tripartite. Each section is focalised through a different narrator, her husband, her brother-in-law, and her sister. Notably, none of which are Yonghai herself. Throughout the novel, Yonghai's gradual renouncement of language becomes synonymous with her approximation towards plant life. In a conversation between In-hai and the emaciated Yonghai, this willed silence as a sign of masochistic desire becomes the ground of a fraught incoherency. Yonghai moved her emaciated face closer to her sister. "I'm not an animal anymore, sister," she said, first scanning the empty ward as if about to disclose a momentous secret. "I don't need to eat, not now. I can live without it. All I need is sunlight." "What are you talking about? Do you really think you've turned into a tree? How could a plant talk? How can you think these things?" Yonghai's eyes shone. A mysterious smile played on her face. "You're right. Soon now, words and thoughts will disappear. Soon. Yonghai burst into laughter, then sighed. Very soon. Just a bit longer to wait, sister. Inhai's exasperated "how can you think these things" is a question of twofold importance. Firstly, it articulates an incoherency at the level of subjectivity. How can you think these things? Speech, and by extension thought, is a characteristic which is used to distinguish humanity from lower orders of being. Speech, therefore, is one factor that renders the human coherent as a subject. Inhai's question, how could a plant talk, highlights the apparent contradiction in Yonghai's becoming plant, where her exercise of agency, thought, and speech are incongruous with her being a plant in any ontologically real sense. It confounds the belief that plants are passive, speechless, and thoughtless. But as Mel E. Chen notes in a study on animacies, refusing language and thought is a dangerous territory. This brings us to the second meaning implicit in Inhai's question, Yonghai's commitment to the eradication of thought and speech, which is coincident with her dehumanization and desubjectification, is evidently a masochistic pleasure. The twinkling of her eyes, the giggle followed by the longing sigh, transplant the cliched signifiers of female desire into a realm that approaches pathology. Thus, Inhai's exasperated "how can you think these things" shows her failure to understand how Yonghai's pleasure can be bound to her ultimate unravelling, her loss of humanity, and her death. This masochistic desire is an anarchic refusal of coherence. The incoherency of such desires has also presented a problem for critics of the text who, at best, read Yonghai's desire as a kind of mental escapism from the brutal forms of patriarchal violence that she is subjected to throughout the novel, and at worst read her queer desires as the symptoms of pathological victimhood. Alex Beeston, sensing some of the radically subversive potential of Yonghai's desires, nonetheless expresses misgivings about what it might mean in real terms to embrace those states of weakness that are objectified under patriarchy. This is understandable, since, as most eco-criticism recognises, nature as a philosophical concept, a potent ideological node, and a cultural repository of norms and moralism, has long been waged against women, people of colour, indigenous peoples, queers, and the lower classes. Plants, then, as they represent dehumanisation and desubjectification, seem odd bedfellows for queer politics. Yet, critical plant theory situates the coming plant within a long history of antisocial and queer feminist resistance. Meeker and Sasbari, for example, note the becoming plant was a way of unbecoming, since plants are not somehow an alternate subjectivity, but instead point to the dissolution of the subject. Both Keatley and Marder, in a discussion of plant horror, locate the subversive potential of the alliance between plants and precarious subjects in the realm of sexuality. Plant proliferation particularly challenges the norms of human sexuality, not least in its power of profuse reproduction in the absence of a confining binary opposition of the two sexes. Plants then dramatically breach confining categories of sex and gender, revelling in a wild both-and sexual power. They are terrifying and alluring, utterly alien to normative gender and sex, and therefore able to figure perverse queer sexual possibilities. The monstrosity and horror of the plant is the simultaneous push and pull, the repulsion and allure, the spiral of pain and pleasure, which Halberstam has identified as key to the figure of the masochist, and which inheres in plant sexuality. This is particularly evident in the responses to Yonghai's body in the novel. Yonghai's brother-in-law initially views Yonghai's starved body as completely liberated of desire. He describes, only then did he realise what it was that had shocked him when he'd first seen her lying prone on the sheet. This was the body of a beautiful young woman, conventionally an object of desire, and yet it was a body from which all desire had been eliminated. But this was nothing so crass as carnal desire, not for her. Rather, or so it seemed, what she had renounced was the very life her body represented. The sunlight that came splintering through the wide window, dissolving into grains of sand, and the beauty of that which, though this was not visible to the eye, was also ceaselessly splintering. Yonghai's brother-in-law is explicitly aware of the way in which Yonghai's starvation is a refusal to cohere, a refusal of a life determined and valued according to a system of carno-philogocentric desire. Yet, despite what Yonghai's brother-in-law claims, her becoming plant is not eradicated of desire. In fact, his own description is underlied and undermined by an aesthetic which combines the beauty and the pain of her ceaselessly splintering. Her desire to become a tree is distinctly libidinal and marks the return of a sublimated sexual impulse. Instead, the turn towards plant being reconfigures her body away from being the object of desire and into a masochistically desiring feminist subject. Both Leo Bassani and Halberstam highlight that masochistic sexuality is a key moment in the dissolution of the human subject. As Bassani says, sex can plunge us into a nightmare of ontological obscenity, which occurs at the prospect of a breakdown of the human, which is achieved through Yonghai's plant becoming and vegetal sexuality. Such a moment is described in a scene when Yonghai's brother has just awoken from a dream. However, the magical realism and structural parallels between this scene and the previous one refutes any attempt to easily distinguish between dream and reality. The first thing he saw when he woke from his brief sleep was her. Her skin was a pale green, her body lay prone in front of him, like a leaf that had just fallen from the branch, only barely begun to wither. The Mongolian mark was gone. Instead, her whole body was covered evenly with that pale wash of green. He turned her over onto her back. A dazzling light came from her naked body, making him squint, and he couldn't see the area above her breasts, as though the source of the light was somewhere around her face. He spread her legs, her thighs parted with an ease that could only mean she was awake. A green sap, like that which oozes from bruised leaves, began to flow out from her vagina when he entered her. The acrid sweetness of the grass was so pungent he found it difficult to breathe. When he pulled out on the point of climax, he saw that the whole of his penis was stained green. A blackish paste was smeared over his skin from his lower stomach to his thighs, a fresh sap which could have been from either her or him. The loss of the human and the familiar groundings of the Western metaphysical construction of the subject is evident in this scene from Yonghai's effacement. Chen highlights that faciality is an important factor in subjectivity. Critical plant theorists highlight that one of plant's most profound differences from humans, and which also adheres with horror and monstrosity, is that vegetation often signally lacks a head. This is important for establishing both subjectivity and humanity, as the head is the highest point of the human body, and thus considered closest to the ethereal sphere of ideas. Confirming its authority as a centre of intelligence, the sovereign decision-making organ, and the radial point from which everything properly human emanates. In this scene, then, everything properly non-human emanates from a profuse middle without a clear beginning or end, namely the genitals. The boundaries between interior and exterior, self and other, and human and non-human are blurred by the profusion of bodily fluids. This image is distinctly passive and still, with no explicit movement or sexual actions. The overwhelming image is of Yonghai, replete with frothing, seething, vital life in the manner of a plant. The dual push and pull, the tangle of desire and horror, is markedly increased when they do have sex and covered in delicate paintings of flowers. Her brother-in-law wonders, would their bodies look like overlapping petals, as they had with her and Jay? Would they seem like one body, a hybrid of plant, animal, and human? His red flower closed and opened repeatedly above her Mongolian mark, his penis slipping in and out of her like a huge pistol. He shuddered at the appalling nature of their union, a union of images that was somehow repellent and yet compellingly beautiful. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the lower half of his body dyed green, soaked from the stomach to the thighs with a sticky, grassy sap. As a result of their masochistic desire, both Yonghai and her brother-in-law experienced the ontological obscenity that Bassani speaks of. By becoming plant, both characters not only communicate with lower orders of being, but they become lower orders of being. Inhai witnesses her sister and her husband's sexual exploits. She is initially so disturbed by the act, so convinced that Yonghai's passivity is in fact a pathology, that she reports both her husband and her sister to the mental health services. Yet, upon later reflection, she recalls the sight of those two naked bodies, twined together like jungle creepers. Of course, it had shocked her at the time, and yet oddly enough, the more time went by, the less she thought of it as something sexual. Covered with flowers and leaves and twisting green stems, those bodies were so altered it was as though they no longer belonged to human beings. The writhing movements of those bodies made it seem as though they were trying to shuck off the human. Vegetal sexuality here lies so far beyond the realms of our ambition to render sex in terms of power that Yonghai's explicit sex acts can no longer be categorized as sexual within a normative framework. She has entered a realm of utter ontological obscenity, where the opposition between pleasure and pain becomes irrelevant, and where all the ontological distinctions which define orders of being are meaningless. Yonghai's masochistic habitation of plant sexuality affects an unravelling, an unbecoming human and an unbecoming subject by disturbing the foundations of sexuality. All three of these scenes are characterised by the alluring pull and the disturbing push of plant horror. INCOHERENT's final moment, the protesting gaze which catalysed the novel and with which I began this paper, is prefaced by INCOHERENT's ambivalent response to these scenes. INCOHERENT cannot help but acknowledge with awe the liberating potential of Yonghai's unbecoming, but ultimately she is unable to reconcile the horror and desire that Yonghai's masochism both expresses and inspires. She thinks she'd been unable to forgive Yonghai for soaring alone over a boundary she could never bring herself to cross, unable to forgive that magnificent irresponsibility that had enabled Yonghai to shuck off social constraints and leave her behind still a prisoner. She finds herself wondering if her husband and Yonghai hadn't smashed through all of the boundaries, if everything hadn't fallen apart, then perhaps she was the one who would have broken down. In these final words, we can discern the queer politics of the novel most clearly. The breakdown of the self and the deconstruction of the boundaries which structure subjectivity are inseparable. Ultimately, this deconstruction ends with a final refusal of life itself, that nonetheless refuses to relinquish pleasure.